Morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session from me, Daniel Ball. So I've been a director at Wax Digital for nigh on the last 20 years or so, and we've been coming to eWorld for most of that time, so hopefully most of you, or at least some of you, are aware of who we are as an organisation. However, this is probably actually the last eWorld that we will be doing in this, under our current identity. And what that sadly means, we'll probably no longer get the opportunity to answer the question, why the hell are you called Wax Digital, on our stand on a regular basis. It does bring some positives with it as well. So, come on. There we go. Following our acquisition by a Swedish company called Medius last November, we'll be rebranding under that name later this year. But I guess that transformation goes quite a lot deeper than just the rebrand. Medius doesn't have, or certainly historically hasn't had, a particularly big presence in the UK, but it is actually one of the world's leading providers of AP automation software. So helping AP teams and ultimately finance teams to get much tighter control of their invoice processing function. And that's great for us, since our background is, of course, more procurement going into finance than the other way around. And typically, and I think it's certainly true for us as well, systems have been generally optimized for one persona or the other. They've either been procurement focused or they've been more finance focused. And I think in terms of bringing those two suites together, we believe we're going to have a really world-class solution for both procurement and finance without any real compromise to either party. And as a joint entity, of course, we've gone from about 100 employees to getting on for 400 employees now, actually, across 4 continents with over 3,500 customers, all backed by one of the world's leading technology private equity firms. But rest assured that, while our horizons are even wider than they were previously, that doesn't for a minute mean that we'll be losing our focus on being the best partner that we can be to our customers, working in collaboration to deliver great procurement and now, of course, finance outcomes, which helps us retain and continue to build on, I would hope, our position as the world's most recommended e-procurement vendor according to Gartner's independent peer insights reviews. Okay, so that's the corporate intro over and done with, and I'd just like to kick off, I guess, this morning's session with a small apology, which is to say that although you might be quite glad to hear it in point of fact, although this is a 40-minute session, I've only created content for about 25 minutes. So you'll be able to get away early for lunch, and that's not just because I'm too lazy to put together 40 minutes worth of content. I think there's a general school of thought. It's generally accepted. There are plenty of studies that support the fact that attention spans don't really go beyond 20 minutes or so. And I wouldn't really want you to lose your attention, or I wouldn't want to lose your attention today, because I think, or at least, I hope certainly, that this is a message which is quite important, an important subject, and hopefully you'll feel that to be the same as well. So, clock's ticking, let's get started. Can we start with a quick straw poll, bit of interactivity, bit of audience interaction. How many of you in this room, when you were, say, 4 or 5 or 6 years old, harboured ambitions to be a procurement professional? No, nobody at all? Really? Okay. I thought not. Okay. So what do we want to be? We wanted to be an astronaut. Or we wanted to be a fireman, or we wanted to be a superhero. Of course we did when we were 4 years old. Partly because, well, who doesn't want to be a superhero? But also, of course, because these were things we'd actually heard of. These were things that we were familiar with through television, through cartoons or comics. But who'd ever heard of being a purchasing professional? Nobody. And even today, now that we're all grown up, procurement is still a bit of an unknown quantity to very many people. They really don't know what it is that you do for a profession. And when you're asked that question on the dance floor, when you lot head out to the clubs this evening after today's event, telling somebody you're in procurement typically elicits a response a bit like this. And to be fair, if you're in procurement, it's a pretty tough icebreaker. You should try telling people you're in e-procurement. That's a real game changer. So procurement can be a rather misunderstood profession, because a lot of people just don't come into a great deal of contact with it. And rather like the shy girl at the back of the class, the procurement function can be a little reticent when it comes to self-promotion. Yet procurement sits in exactly the right place, I think, and has precisely the correct remit, really, to be front and centre, the most important and impactful function within any organisation. It's just a question of looking at it through the right lens. And on that subject, I heard a story recently, a really nice little story, about a shy little girl who was in a drawing lesson. So this was a 6-year-old girl sitting at the back, drawing. The teacher said this girl was typically very quiet, very reserved, didn't like drawing attention to herself. But in this particular lesson, she was unusually animated and eager to engage. So the teacher was fascinated, went over to her and said, "What are you drawing?" And the girl said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher said, "But nobody knows what God looks like." And the little girl said, "They will in a minute." So all of a sudden we see that little girl through a slightly different lens. And it's that kind of tilt in the lens, I think, that we need to shine on procurement, illuminating its true capability, not just to impact the organisation that you work within on an organisational level, but on a societal one too. Bringing those things together as genuine kind of procurement leaders in the Roman sense of the concept. I think quite interesting, given the fact that we probably know the names of more Roman emperors than we do prime ministers. The Roman language didn't actually have a word for leadership. It was a fairly limited language, Latin. So they co-opted other words, and one of the words that they used was a word adduco, which means to draw out or to grow from within. And that growth principle, I think, is key to leading both your company and the world around as we'll get to a better place. So let's think about your company first. What does the board really care about? Well, cost savings, of course. Continually reducing costs remains a key focus. But looking beyond that, it's actually within procurement's gift to deliver so much more, to help influence and deliver on the answers to the biggest questions that every business leader is tasked with finding the answers to. Questions like, how do we reduce employee turnover? How do we attract great talent in the first place? And how do we increase corporate revenues? All without loading additional cost into the business. And my assertion is that procurement can take the lead on all of those questions, transforming both business outcomes and social outcomes without compromising on either front. And in so doing, establish a real leadership position in a way that really matters both personally, as individuals, and professionally. So I want to show you a few examples, firstly on the global stage, and then bring that down perhaps to a more relatable local scale. So the first company I'm going to look at is Nestlé. We have no affiliation to Nestlé, they're not a client of ours, sadly. But they do have a very clear and obvious supply chain situation for one of their main product lines, which is chocolate. And Nestlé sells £4.8 billion worth of chocolate a year globally, from Lion Bars to Aeros, Kit Kats to After Eights. And chocolate's main ingredient, of course, is cocoa, which is generally sourced from poor third world countries like the Ivory Coast, where social issues like environmental protection and child labour can cause big problems for big brands on the one hand, but more importantly, have a direct impact on the lives, the well-being of people within those countries, and indeed all of us when it comes to looking after the planet. So big business takes this pretty seriously. As you can see on screen, Nestlé invests heavily in traceability, in local healthcare and safety initiatives, and environmental protection in those countries where they're buying their raw ingredients. And it makes great currency of its initiatives to eradicate child labour from that supply chain.
We committed to making chocolate sustainably. We owe this to our consumers, the chocolate lovers, to the farmers, and the communities who grow cocoa. Basically, we owe it to everyone. Child labor is unacceptable to us. Over the past 10 years, we have invested 220 million Swiss francs in the Nestlé Cocoa Plan. A big part of this investment goes into preventing child labor by giving children in cocoa communities the chance of a quality education and a brighter future.
interestingly, with no small irony, considering I included this in the presentation a couple of weeks ago, last week this happened. There was a dispatcher's investigation that broke the claim that a Nestlé group company, in this case Nespresso, was actually sourcing coffee beans from farms that were exploiting child labour. And this became national news very quickly, as you can see here, obviously. So an organisation that has given over £30 million to George Clooney in recent years to promote their brand, before they even begin to spend anything else at all on marketing, can see that investment thrown straight back at them when the face of the brand becomes effectively the face of the brand's problems. And you can see just how serious an issue this, this is for Nestlé and Nespresso, since on that very day, were you to visit the Nespresso website, the first thing you would be presented with was a video from the chief executive before you could actually access the website, explaining why it is or what they were doing about that situation. And as a consequence, the company, quite rightly, of course, incurs not just the poor publicity, but also the cost of rectification on the ground, significant further investment. So other companies are trying to work to reduce risk, both, again, obviously from their own product portfolio, but also in a very real sense from things like global nutritional perspectives. So here's an interesting set of statistics, okay? In a world where we are presently, of course, all too very conscious of the capacity for disease to spread around the globe very quickly and with dramatic effect, we actually get 60% of our calories as a species from just 3 crops: rice, wheat, and corn. And within those crop families, we've concentrated that consumption on a very narrow band of varieties. So while India once planted 30,000 varieties of rice from the 90,000 that exist, now 75% of its production comes from fewer than 10 varieties of rice. So you can imagine the impact on global food supplies if there was a disease, which is made all the more likely by the kind of intensive farming operations that we have today, that actually destroyed large parts of just one of those crop varieties. The impact would be absolutely catastrophic. So organisations like Kellogg's, for example, who've obviously been, in truth, part of the issue when it comes to propagating kind of industrial monocrop farming in the past, are really waking up to both the potential risk but also to their responsibility to be a good corporate citizen and to take steps to enhance biodiversity. So in what is very much an enterprise strategy that includes everyone from marketing through food science, but importantly sees procurement front and centre of that programme, the company is broadening its sourcing remit, introducing a huge variety of plant-diverse products that people probably don't even know Kellogg's are responsible for. So on top of new cereals formulated around oats and rye and spelt and sorghum, Kellogg's is also branching into product areas such as juices, energy bars, and innovative plant-based meat alternatives like leaf jerky, for example. In fact, Kellogg's is now the biggest manufacturer of meat substitute products in the USA. And as a central player in initiatives such as the Chef's Manifesto, which is bringing together hundreds of leading chefs across the globe to pledge their support to a more sustainable and diverse future. So, okay, we don't all have long, complex supply chains. We don't all have access, or to some extent the need, to become directly involved with those supply chains in the way that major companies like Nestlé and Kellogg's do. But that is not to say that we can't make a huge difference through even the most seemingly prosaic procurement decisions and practices. And my thinking on this is simply to add a third pillar to a very simple sourcing and supplier selection framework. Now, as I say, I do appreciate this is pretty simplistic, but at the highest level, we tend to look for 2 main things when we go to market, when we actually source new suppliers. We look at cost, quite obviously. That's the thing that procurement is still most keenly judged on. And capability. Is this a supplier, or are these suppliers capable of doing what we're asking them to do in a way that actually meets or exceeds our expectations? To those 2 pillars, we can add a third one, I think, which is conscience. Does the choice of this supplier actually make a positive societal contribution in some way, shape, or form? And that is the transformative C when it comes to transforming the outcomes of your everyday procurement activity and turning it into a genuine force for good. So to illustrate, we talked to one of our clients at our last, we have an annual client forum called Fusion. And in fact, we actually ran a panel discussion at our last client forum on this very subject. And one of the companies that took part in that panel was the insurance provider NFU Mutual. And we talked to them about a sourcing event that they'd run on our sourcing platform. It was the archetypal kind of cannon fodder sourcing event. It was going to market for a new stationery provider. And they ran the typical sort of RFX to e-auction, multi-stage selection process with half a dozen or so potential providers, but with one important difference. I guess they included that third C as a scoring criteria within that process. And when it came to awarding that stationery contract, they didn't compromise on price and they didn't compromise on capability, but they did also make a selection which satisfied that conscience criteria. So they chose a company called Wild Hearts, which some of you may know. Wild Hearts is primarily a stationery supplier, but it donates all of its profits to its own foundation. And that foundation then funds a range of charitable initiatives, including funding young entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds and providing things like education and healthcare investment opportunities in third world countries. Which means that with every big biro bought across the organization, and if you've ever seen one of our purchase to pay demonstrations, nod to Carl, you'll know a lot about that a lot of big biro buying goes on. But NFU Mutual employees, with every one of those biros, with every piece of stationery that they buy, they're contributing in however small a way to a fundamentally better world. And that feel-good factor is contagious. It extends to a lot of other categories at an organization like NFU, where the organization has either already or intends to work with suppliers that put social contribution and development at the heart of their thinking and practice. Companies like the Soap Company, giving employment to disabled and blind employees. Companies like Inside Job, where they're taking ex-female offenders and mental health people into film and digital production. And Auticon, which is an IT services company, all of whose consultants are on the autism spectrum. And there are dozens more out there. Companies like Blue Bear Coffee, back to coffee again, hopefully doing a better job than Nestle about ensuring that all of their coffee is produced without anyone being exploited and paying their farmers well above fair market rate. Companies like Paint 360, who re-engineer waste paint back into new paint, where each litre of paint contains at least 65% recycled content. Now, the relative economics of social purchasing demonstrate what a remarkable impact we can have. So if you look at the combined total of all of the CSR spent directly by Fortune 500 companies in the UK and the US, it amounts to about $15 billion a year, which is a pretty substantial amount of money, obviously. But if you compare that to the $23 trillion which is spent every year on goods and services, it's apparent that if even some of that spend can be targeted towards suppliers who have, again, even in part, a remit which includes social improvement, then the impact can absolutely dwarf the direct spend CSR figure in terms of the societal benefit that it can bring. So the size of the prize is potentially enormous, which makes it all the more remarkable to me that so few organizations yet adopt this as a procurement goal, as a core precept on which they want to do business with their suppliers. In fact, amongst our client base, certainly, there were very few, especially outside of the highly regulated industries such as financial services, that really embed this as a principle within their purchasing activity. And you can forget about the social impact that we can have here when we spend our money. Selling this internally and believing in it as an organization, all you need to do is remind yourself about the 3 headline business returns. Business returns, again, that should be at the top of any CEO's agenda. So, how do we reduce employee turnover? Well, let's look at some stats on that. So the figures here from Deloitte and from Babson indicate the massive impact, especially on younger employees or millennials, to coin the phrase, the alignment between corporate and personal belief systems has on retention. 82% of millennials will stay with the business for over 5 years when those beliefs are aligned. you'll have a 50% lower staff turnover when people believe they work in an organisation that puts society first. And how about this one for a stat down here as well? Improvements in CSR, of which this is kind of a key constituent, have the same effect on retention as a £2,400 annual salary increase. What a huge ROI that is. Look at attracting great people in the first place, never mind retaining them. How do we get the right candidates into our business? That's keying into the same mindset, really, obviously, putting in place the foundations of a business that people actually feel good working for and want to join. And of course, increasing revenues. The CEO doesn't want to increase revenues. Again, 20% increase can be achieved in a company's revenue as a result of their corporate responsibility strategy. Obviously, it depends kind of what kind of company you are and what you're selling as to how big or otherwise that figure is going to be. But nonetheless, by being a company that people actually feel good about buying from, you can increase your top line. All without any real additional cost to the business. This is what you do anyway. It's just about doing it slightly differently. It's not about incurring costs. It's not about wholesale change of process or practice. We're not going to accept a worse service. We're not going to pay any more, but we are going to credit you as a supplier. We're possibly even going to insist on the fact of your ability to evidence a positive social impact from your operations. And that's where procurement technology comes in. Had to come in somewhere, didn't it, obviously. The beauty of using a source-to-pay suite, just like the one that we provide, is that you can apply these principles much more broadly, much more effectively, much more of the time. From supplier onboarding that electronically assures compliance to your minimum standards, through electronic tendering with templates and automated scoring against social and environmental criteria. Supplier relationship and performance management, which holds suppliers accountable to the promises that they've made. And purchase to pay, of course, which ensures that your employees are buying from those suppliers. Procurement technology not only helps in finding and selecting suppliers that meet these criteria, it plays a fundamental role in keeping them honest and ensuring that your spend is funneled effectively towards them with a minimum of leakage. And as a provider, we can help further. We can issue you with a file of social enterprise suppliers that fit the bill and load straight into your Wax Digital or other even sourcing software, for consideration in your next tender. But procurement software also empowers, I think, you to drive change in suppliers that aren't social enterprise suppliers at this point in time. And that's possibly even more powerful because, for the hundreds of social enterprise suppliers that there are out there, there are thousands more that don't fit that mold. And it's only through the power of purchasing, through the pressure that you apply to suppliers, by the choices that you make, by the standards you set, by the questions that you ask through these processes, that picture will actually change. So ultimately, as a procurement professional, when you direct hundreds or thousands of people across your organization to buy from suppliers with a social conscience, whether those suppliers were born with it or whether they frankly adopted it as a consequence of you pressuring them to do so, you're casting thousands of votes for the type of world that we all want to live in. Which means those of you who as 4-year-olds maybe dreamed of growing up to be a superhero are just a little bit closer to actually living that dream. Thank you very much.